evening, everyone. I'm Laura Ingraham, and this is the Ingraham Angle on what was a historic day. You've been hearing a lot about the Trump-Putin meeting, not a summit, but I guarantee you will get analysis here that you're not going to find anywhere else, so stick it right here. Stick with us through the hour. You don't want to miss a minute. Plus, Raymond Arroyo will be here to tell you about a sick cartoon that was published by the New York Times. It is unbelievable. And back stateside, anti-police protests in Chicago got violent over the weekend after a police shooting. Mark Furman breaks down the surprising revelation in the officer's body cam footage. And Judge Jeanine will tell us how things are only going to get worse for those anti-Trump texting FBI lovebirds, Peter Strzok and Lisa Page. But first, Trump and Putin go to Helsinki. That's the focus of tonight's angle. For 3 hours today, President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin met at a summit in Helsinki. And though the meeting's now in the history books, the fallout and the political tax have just begun. Now, so much of the commentary today was devoid of even the slightest hint of context or history, so we thought we'd try to rectify that tonight. He was following a strategy that he's used effectively with Xi Jinping of China and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. And the president, of course, was gracious and chummy with Vladimir Putin today. President Trump prefers to turn on the charm in person while using the hammer and sickle behind the scenes. But the president made his objective clear. He was there to begin a true reset of our relationship with Russia.
Cooperation between our two countries has the potential to save hundreds of thousands of lives. We have 90% of nuclear power between the two countries. As president, I cannot make decisions on foreign policy in a futile effort to appease partisan critics or the media or Democrats who want to do nothing but resist and obstruct. I would rather take a political risk in pursuit of peace than to risk peace in pursuit of politics.
I think that was my favorite line of today. Well written. The two leaders did hit on a range of key issues.
We also discussed one of the most critical challenges facing humanity, nuclear proliferation. Discussed the scourge of radical Islamic terrorism. I addressed directly with President Putin the issue of Russian interference in our elections. Spent a great deal of time talking about it.
And indeed, it was on that subject of Russian interference in our election where the president gave kind of a verbal gift to his critics.
My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
Don't use the word strong and powerful. Immediately following the presser, though, you would have thought that Trump actually had defected to Russia, given the mass hysteria.
You have been watching perhaps one of the most disgraceful performances by an American president.
He's with someone, like Putin, who is a thug, a world-class thug, that he sides with him again and again against his own country's interests.
You have the president, the leader of the free world, taking the word of Vladimir Putin, who, from all accounts, inside the U.S. government, the U.S. intelligence community, the law enforcement community, attacked American democracy in 2016. They came across as playmates on a soccer field.
You should call this the Surrender Summit.
Surrender? Now, did I miss something today? Did Donald Trump withdraw U.S. sanctions on Russia? Or did he invite back those 60 diplomats and others he expelled in March from Russia? Did he cancel future sales of lethal weapons to Ukraine? Of course he didn't. But he might as well have, given the media and liberal hyperbole on what happened today. Today, Obama's CIA director, John Brennan, tweeted in part, Donald Trump's press conference performance in Helsinki rises and exceeds the threshold of high crimes and misdemeanors. It was nothing short of treasonous. And I just laugh about that. And why did no one call it surrender, by the way, when in 2009, President Obama nixed the European missile defense shield that was to be built in Poland? Was that a surrender to Putin? Or was it a surrender or collusion when Obama asked Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev for a little favor until the 2012 election was over?
This is my last election, basically. Yeah. After my election, I have more flexibility. Yeah.
I understand. I transmit this information to Vladimir.
I mean, they're holding hands there. They're practically spooning. What was that? A profile in patriotism? And I don't recall the media kicking up any fuss when Obama joined Cuban dictator Raul Castro for a baseball game or normalized relations with that murderous regime. By the way, a puppet of Russia. Now, you can also say this. Trump clearly should not have created any semblance of moral equivalency between our intel community, even if it has its flaws, which it does, and the assurances of Vladimir Putin. As the recent indictment of Russian agents alleged, there was meddling in the election. Bipartisan members of congressional panels concluded that. So did our Director of National Intelligence. But it also, no sense that it affected the outcome of the 2016 election, and no Americans were named in last week's indictment. So President Trump probably should have said it that way, or addressed it that way. Instead, he kind of committed an unforced error. But look, the president is right at the same time to be frustrated by the anvil that the deep state has hung around his neck for 2 years now. First, the elements within the FBI, Lisa Page and Peter Strzok. And now, Mueller and his ever-expanding team. And we know inside the DOJ, they basically protected Hillary Clinton while attempting to damn and undermine the legitimacy of Trump's election. And this gnaws at the president. And it perhaps explains why he let those wounds get the better of him today. But it is a good thing to improve our relationship with Russia. And at the same time, we cannot appear to buy their obvious deception while we're standing on the world stage. And, you know, I'm doing a lot of while at the same times, but this is a complicated thing. And I think while insulting Putin on camera, like doing that, like Donald Trump versus Vladimir Putin in a total insult fest, that wouldn't have accomplished anything. At the same time, there are other subtler ways to make our concerns and our objections known. And the president should have taken that path. U.S. National Intelligence Director Dan Coats issued a statement in the wake of the summit today. He said the following: "We've been clear in our assessments of Russian meddling in the 2016 election and their ongoing pervasive efforts to undermine our democracy. And we will continue to provide unvarnished and objective intelligence in support of our national security." Now, setting aside the overly dramatic reactions and even the president's at times poor or unfortunate word choice, let's look for a moment at what Trump is substantively doing vis-a-vis Russia. He's building up the U.S. military. Key. At a NATO summit, he called out the German-Russian Nord Stream gas pipeline, that scheme, Nord Stream 2. In March of this year, he imposed sanctions on 5 Russian entities and 19 individuals for interfering in the 2016 election. The media don't like to remind you of that one, of course. That doesn't fit their narrative. And, of course, he closed the Russian consulate in Seattle. And, as I alluded to earlier, he expelled Russian diplomats and suspected spies, 60 of them. So, if Trump is Putin's poodle, he has a really odd way of showing it. As Walter Russell Mead wrote in American Interest last year, if Trump really was a Russian mole, he would be doing things like the following: limiting fracking as much as possible, blocking oil and gas pipelines, cutting U.S. military spending, and trying to tamp down tensions with Russia's ally, Iran. But Trump's doing none of that. So the selective indignation on the left is truly hilarious. They keep changing their stories for decades. They favored a conciliatory stance, first toward the Soviet Union, then toward the Russian Federation. And now they're all pretending to care about Russia and casting Trump as a Putin surrogate. But it's good to remember just a few years ago how certain liberals reacted when then presidential candidate Mitt Romney suggested that Russia was a foe.
The 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back because the Cold War has been over for 20 years.
In many of the areas where we are working to solve problems, Russia has been an ally.
Governor Romney's answer, I thought, was incredibly revealing. He acts like he thinks the Cold War is still on. Russia is still our major adversary. I don't know where he's been.
Mitt Romney talks like he's only seen Russia by watching Rocky IV.
So which is it? Should we be getting closer to Russia and Putin? Or should we have a dynamic of constant confrontation and hostility? The liberals change their views, clearly depending on which party has the White House. I think in the end, what really matters is how Trump handles the Russian relationship going forward. So despite some of these verbal missteps, the president has already put us, I think, in a better position by engaging Russia and opening dialogue. It's just a start. And that's the angle. Joining me now for reaction is Scott Uehlinger, a former CIA officer based in Russia, Stephen Yates, a former deputy assistant to Vice President Dick Cheney for National Security Affairs, and here in the studio, Matt Schlapp, chairman of the American Conservative Union. Matt, your reaction.
Yeah, I think what you said really captures it, which is the most important part of this is the policy. Should we be getting along with Putin's Russia? Absolutely. The idea that you have liberals almost calling for open warfare is absurd. By the same token, it's fair to criticize the president today. He had some errant answers. He gave some answers that are actually uncoupled from his own tough policy. And I think when we go back to what's important, looking at the policy, I think he's got it dead on right.
Scott, your time in Russia as a CIA officer, watching Vladimir Putin, you see he never really left the KGB behind. I mean, he is crafty. He's very canny, savvy, the way he answers questions, turns them around on the journalists and so forth. But what was your big takeaway from today, the media focusing on Trump's seeming to draw a moral equivalence between U.S. intel services and Putin's assurances?
Well, as you had said, Laura, the selective outrage of the liberal media is breathtaking to behold. They criticize President Trump almost as if he was sending $150 billion on a pallet to Iran, for example. But in fact, our policies directed against Russia are considerably stronger than they were a decade ago, and it's starting to tell. Another key point that perhaps you missed was that our present energy policy of exporting, increasing our exports of natural gas to northern Europe is in fact undercutting Russian natural gas and hurting them where they live. It's depriving President Putin of the revenue he needs for mischief making abroad. So our policies are working, and in this case, deeds speak stronger than the occasional gaffes of the U.S. president.
Yeah, Scott, I think if Donald Trump were up there and just started lobbing insults at Putin, I think that gives Putin a real PR victory at home, because he can go home and say, look, we've gotten so much under their skin. Look, I stood up to the president, and he doesn't. But you use that for your nationalistic ends at home.
That's right. Absolutely.
I lived in the Soviet Union in the old days in 1983 for a semester in college, and that was when Andropov was president. That was in the real dark days of the quickie presidential terms back then. But the idea that he's going to just lob insults at him, that is just ridiculous. It's unrealistic. We don't do that with President Xi. Obama didn't. And as far as I can tell, neither did Bush. We rolled out the red carpet, and China took 50 million of our personnel files during the Obama administration. I never even heard him talk about it.
That's right. And another thing to remember is that we have an unprecedented, incredibly biased press. Now, I can't imagine right now if there was at the Reykjavik summit with President Reagan and Gorbachev having a Western media that would be asking Reagan in front of the world's cameras to denounce the leader of, or in this
Soviet
case,
Union. Yeah,
right, Gorbachev as a liar to his face, because this shows that the progressive mainstream media is more willing to grenade throw in the name of derailing Trump than it is in supporting any possible improvement in relations.
Let's get Stephen in on this. Stephen, when Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, the left went crazy. You're saber rattling. They called him Ronnie Reagan. We're going to talk to Craig Shirley biographer shortly about this. They went nuts. They said Reagan was kicking the hornet's nest in the Soviet Union. We should get along with the Soviet Union. That was during the Cold War. Now we're post-Cold War. We still have challenges. But now they want to get tough on Russia. I'm howling at this, because for those of us who were around this town in the 80s, and if we worked in the Reagan administration, you couldn't get a break with the left on his dealings with the Soviet Union. But now they want to set up a shadow government. I want to play something for you, Stephen, for you to react to. This is Philip Mudd, former CIA man under Obama. Let's watch.
FBI director continues the investigation. Department of Justice continues support for the investigation. Congress continues saying that this investigation is legitimate. Curious point in American government. When do we see almost a shadow government come out and say, we cannot side with the government, whether it's the cabinet or the Senate? I think that's the big question.
Stephen, shadow government needs to form to apparently undo the presidential election. Your reaction?
Well, where's a former Obama CIA director calling treason when you need him? Because that's actually what that would be. And I think we've really run the limits on absolute Trump derangement syndrome across the board on how people react to this kind of thing. But really, I think the president was trying to do two hard things at one time today, and that might have been what's tripped up some of the communications. I agree completely on the strategy side of it that you got in the angle. He's restoring realism, trying to get great power relations back on track, balancing one power against another to try to solve real problems. The proof of this is in results, not in instantaneous sound bites. But he's also the deal maker. He wants something now. And he's jumping in there, and I think the deal maker in him used some traits there in the presser that complicated what I think he's actually doing very well on the longer term strategy.
Fascinating. Matt, this is what the media were saying today about what the intel chiefs should be doing here in the United States in reaction to what we saw in Helsinki. Let's watch.
President Trump basically said he believes Vladimir Putin over his intelligence community. Should the director of national intelligence, Dan Coats, resign in protest?
I think the right thing for Dan Coats to do would be to send a clear message and say he can no longer serve this president.
How does Gina Haspel stay on the job? How does Dan Coats stay on the job? He has now rebuked their professional assessment of Russia's role in meddling in the 2016 election.
Everyone's got to resign, apparently, because Trump had that press conference.
Because President Trump is doing what the previous administrations tried to do. Remember the reset button. Remember your clip about Medvedev saying, let's wait till after the election.
No, he went like this, Matt. He held Medvedev's hand. It was like this. Can you imagine if Trump held Vladimir Putin's hand today?
I mean, this is what
I will translate that to Vladimir later. Thank you very much,
when
Mr. President.
Other presidents try to start the relationship off on the right foot, they're called, warriors for peace. Donald Trump tries to do that, and he's called deranged, and people should look. I agree with you. He had some answers that were off the mark, but the policy is right, and the president needs to understand he's winning on this. Just stick to the course.
No, he's winning on it, and I think there are two things you can hold in your mind at the same time. Number one, having a better relationship with Russia. I heard Bill Richardson say that on TV today. We had Obama say it, Hillary say it, Bush said it. He drove around his pickup truck with Vladimir Putin. Remember that at Crawford?
He looked into his heart. Remember that?
And he saw his soul. But so, Stephen, I think you could have those two thoughts in your mind. Better relationship with Russia, and also have a clear-eyed view of what Russia's complex history. They're very proud people. They love the motherland still. The glory days, they don't want them to be behind them, but their economy has shrunk. Their population is shrinking. They're, in many ways, on the decline. And they're not the threat that China is to us. I mean, their economy, what is it, half the size of California's? I mean, it's ridiculous.
Well, Europe's economy dwarfs that of Russia at this point, and that's what made it even more laughable when we were having a discussion about NATO and whether European countries should pay their fair share. And I think, if Nixon can go to China during the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution, when literally dozens and dozens of millions of Chinese people were killed by their own government.
60 million. Yeah.
And we can talk about geopolitics and real things that need to change in the world, because even more lives are at stake if we don't. That's what's going on. When you're talking about the nuclear stockpile, it's not just whether Russia uses it, it's whether Russia sells it and proliferates it. And so that's the stakes.
All right. A fascinating panel. Thank you all. Great perspectives. And by the way, President Trump and Putin are each speaking separately with Fox News tonight. But can the U.S.-Russia relationship be repaired given the partisan politics here at home? Answers next.
I looked at.
Oh boy, the drama from today's Trump-Putin summit didn't stop at their press conference. The two leaders each sat down with Fox News this evening. Here's President Trump speaking with Sean Hannity about the impediments to change.
90% of the nuclear power in the world between these two nations. And we've had a phony witch hunt deal drive us apart.
This is the biggest wedge. This was the biggest wedge.
It's the thing that he told me when he went in. He said, what a shame. He felt it was very hard for me to make a deal because of, all of this nonsense.
Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin was pressed by Chris Wallace about Russian meddling in the 2016 election.
Do you really believe that someone acting from the Russian territory could have influenced the United States and influenced the choice of millions of Americans? This is utterly ridiculous.
Joining us now with reaction, Ian Bremmer, the president and founder of the Eurasia Group, Monica Crowley from the London Center for Policy Research, and along with Ariel Cohen, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Ariel, let's start with you. You heard the angle, my view on the angle, some verbal missteps, but the substantive policy coming out of this administration toward Russia, in my mind, is quite realistic and pragmatic, given the difficulties with Russia, the challenges, the deception, and also a hope for a better future.
Well, definitely we should all hope for the better future. However, to expect that Russia is somehow going to change, that they're going to address a terrible crisis in Ukraine, occupation and annexation of the Crimea, is not realistic. So probably Mr. Trump is trying to do several things. One, he is addressing the nuclear issue. We all need some kind of arms control. Second, I think he's trying to detach Russia from China. Good luck with that, but if you didn't try, you won't.
Don't you think that's a pretty big deal?
It's a huge deal. Nobody's talking about it.
China's the real threat to the United States today.
China is a competitor. China is a huge competitor economically, geopolitically.
What's the size of the economy of China versus Russia? Give me the rough estimate.
China is probably
8 times, 10 times.
It's about 8 times bigger.
It dwarfs Russia's economy.
But it's getting closer to our economy. That's a problem. And they're catching up in a number of technologies that are absolutely vital.
He wants to triangulate China-Russia, doesn't he not? That's part of what he wants to do.
But he's not explaining that. He's getting attacked.
Yeah.
But I think the main problem I had watching the summit, watching these dynamics, is not the policy, but presentation by Mr. Trump, who now is in a unique position of fighting the intelligence community and fighting most of the media.
Yeah.
I do believe that trying to get the Russians long-term on side with the United States against China would be a smarter strategy. China, frankly, is going to overwhelm Russia economically, demographically. But the ability, as Ariel said, of the Americans to do that at this point is really zero. Furthermore, if you want to try to triangulate China, you'd want the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You'd want a good relationship with America's allies in Europe. You'd want a good relationship with American ally in Japan. Trump's not working on any of those things.
Our relationship with Japan is very strong. Our relationship with the NATO allies, from Merkel to Macron to even Theresa May, they all seem to be very positive coming out of that summit. Even the NATO Secretary General, when she was pressed by Christiane Amanpour, she was trying to get him to say, he said it was a very good summit for us.
I wish that was
So they're all lying? They don't say?
No, of course they're diplomatic because they don't want to break NATO. And I mean, they're trying to do their best to
They got to pay their fair share, Ian. The American people
I'm not saying that's not true. I'm just saying that if Trump is trying to build an alliance vis-a-vis China, which I think we all believe is the most important strategic thing to do, he's not gone about that very effectively. Look, foreign policy is not
it's complex.
His bag. It's not easy.
Well, he's new to it. I mean, in a few moments, we're going to hear about some of the major foreign policy blunders by presidents when a lot more was at stake even at this.
Laura,
but he's a year and a half into this.
The thing I would have liked, Laura, today, most importantly, would have been for him to listen to his advisors. Would have been for that 2-hour meeting at the beginning, because he's new to it, not to try to do it by himself, but instead actually have the people around him that are trying to work for the United States long term.
The bilat stuff they did simultaneously and beforehand, I think I heard was very, very positive. But Monica, look, some of these points are well taken. I think, our panel here all believes that China is the real threat to the United States long-term militarily. It's the largest standing army. Economy is going to dwarf ours, stealing our technology. South China Sea, they're moving into Africa and beyond. But nevertheless, Obama back in 2016, I remember, I think it was October of 2016, or December of 2016, he was talking about, the fact that he didn't confront Vladimir Putin on this Russian meddling when he could have confronted it as president. Listen to what he said.
It's not like Putin's going around the world publicly saying, look what we did, wasn't that clever. He denies it. So the idea that somehow public shaming is going to be effective, I think doesn't read the thought process in Russia very well.
All right, Monica, a few of us on the panel lived in the Soviet Union for short periods of time or longer periods of time. And the idea of shaming Russia on the world stage, I mean, I think Obama was right there. You don't get anything from the Russians by shaming them. I think that gives Putin a huge victory at home. Ariel might disagree, but Monica, your shot at this. Obama was kind of interesting in what he said there, but the media seemed to forget this.
Well, yes, that's exactly right. Look, the Obama administration was made aware, including all the way up to the president himself, certainly during the spring months and then later of 2016, that the Russians were engaged in these active measures to disrupt the American electoral process. What we also forget is that the Russians targeted the Republican National Committee servers and their sort of computerized systems. They weren't able to penetrate those, but they were able to penetrate the DNCs. The idea that somehow all of this is new, we know that the Russians have been actively engaged in trying to disrupt American elections, Western elections, really since the advent of the Cold War. What's different now is that they have these cyber capabilities that take it to a whole other level.
And they're serious. This is serious.
And they're serious, yes. And so while I support the president's attempt to really try to reset the Russian relationship, unlike Mrs. Clinton and President Obama and their failed attempt, I support the overall effort. But the core strength of the American president's power is his moral authority. And I would have liked to have seen a stronger public statement on behalf of the president to condemn this. I mean, we remember in 2009, Laura, when the Iranian people rose up against the Iranian regime, we pounded President Obama for not at least speaking a word of moral support for them. I would have liked to have seen the president give some moral statement against what the Russians have done, not just to us, but to our allies.
And that's why, Ariel, we pounded Obama when he was with Medvedev, held his hand and said, give us more flexibility after the election. I'll transmit your views to Vladimir. I mean, we pounded that. The Democrats, the media ignored that. What did flexibility mean? What did he mean by that? We never got an answer.
But Laura, if you remember President Reagan, he took the high moral ground. He talked about the shining city of the hill, and he also improved the relationship with the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union was ready for that. And I think that model should guide Mr. Trump as well.
Let's just be clear that there are a bunch of things that people were concerned Trump was going to do that he didn't do. He didn't actually say that Ukraine is done.
Sanctions are gone.
He didn't actually say that Crimea is Russian. He didn't actually say the Americans are going to stop military exercises in the Balts. Didn't actually say the Americans are going to pull troops out of Syria. I mean, for all of the moral equivalency and the stagecraft that he should not have done, the fact is that the content of U.S.-Russia relations today are exactly the same as they were yesterday, and that's an appropriate thing.
Substance versus verbal misstep. Interesting. We'll see how it goes going forward. And by the way, one of the biggest things missing from today's summit, historical context. But we've got an esteemed presidential historian to cut through all that noise. We're going to take a look at the New York Times' ugly cultural narrative being created about the summit with Raymond Arroyo next. While the left and the media are going into absolute hysterics over today's meeting between Trump and Putin, let's put the summit in some historical context. Best-selling author and Ronald Reagan historian Craig Shirley joins me with more. Craig, as you watch this unfold today, did it remind you of any mistakes by rookie presidents in the past?
Sure. Thank you, Laura. It reminded me of, in some ways, of Kennedy at Vienna with Khrushchev in 1961. You know, they got into a free-for-all debate over the merits of the Western system versus the East, and Kennedy couldn't mount an effective defense of the free market or democracy, and Khrushchev came away from the summit very, very unimpressed with Kennedy's performance, which, you know, a lot of people thought, a lot of historians thought at the time, emboldened Khrushchev to keep going with the Berlin crisis and later build the wall, and then later thereafter to put missiles into Cuba. Fortunately, Kennedy found his steel and forced the missiles out, but it was a disastrous summit by all accounts. Obviously, Yalta also for FDR was also a disaster. You know, he went in there thinking Joe Stalin was a good guy. I'm going to give him what he wants, and I'm not going to ask anything in return. And we ceded millions of people to the Eastern Bloc, millions of people in the now the Warsaw Pact countries who ended up living in enslavement under the Soviet Union for many years.
What about Nixon and Brezhnev? Or one of his summits was kind of a disaster.
Well, Nixon gave too much away to Brezhnev. Nixon and Kissinger were interested in a good photo op, and they were interested in the trophy on the wall. Nixon gave grain sales to the Soviets. He gave loan guarantees to the Soviets. Didn't really ask anything in return, and that was the point. Is that Reagan understood what these other presidents didn't understand. Is the Soviets will take and take and take until you draw a line in the sand. Back in 1964, Reagan understood this in his famous speech for Barry Goldwater, is that the Soviet Union will, and he knew this from his days in Hollywood, fighting off Soviet provocateurs with the Hollywood trade unions, is the Soviets will never stop until somebody stands up to them. And that's what Reagan understood, what FDR only understood in the last couple weeks of his life, where he admitted to a reporter before he passed away that it was a mistake to trust Joseph Stalin. Carter found out to his dismay it was a mistake to trust Brezhnev, because within weeks of the SALT II treaty being signed, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. That's what Trump needs to understand, is that the culture of whether it's the Soviets or the Russians, it doesn't matter. They respect strength, they abhor weakness, and you have to deal with them from a position of strength.
So how would you have advised him to have handled this today differently?
Well, I would have, pointed out the areas of agreement and pointed out the need to keep talking, but pointed out the fundamental differences between the United States and Russia, and that there were things that just couldn't be overcome whatsoever, and that it's just a fact of life. But he should have dealt from a position of strength and not undermine his own intelligence agencies. Look, he can clean this up. Kennedy cleaned it up. FDR didn't, obviously. He passed away. But he can make amends. He can make repairs to this. The point, I think, Laura, is that the mistakes that Trump made today aren't earth-shaking. They're not
substantive. That was the point of my angle. Yeah, they're not substantive. They're verbal. It's an approach and tone, which, it is what it is now. But he didn't agree to substantive caves on key issues. We have a pretty realistic, tough approach to Russia. And he just thinks we should try to figure out ways to work together, which is what Obama said, Bush said, Clinton wanted. They all wanted this. And none of it came to much fruition. But Craig, the historical part of this is so important. And I so much appreciate you joining us tonight, because people look, if it didn't happen in the New York Times today, most people think it never happened. So we really appreciate your insight. Thanks so much. And by the way, another story, the New York Times, about how vicious things are getting, recently published this bizarre, idiotic video about the Trump-Putin meeting that some are calling gross and even homophobic. New York Times bestselling author and Fox News contributor Raymond Arroyo is here with reaction. Raymond, what is this all about?
Well, this is part of a series that the New York Times opinion page has mounted. They have 3 installments. It's called Trump Bites. And this particular video, and again, this is all about narrative, okay? This is what the pop culture and people who aren't focused on policy take away. This one is called Trump and Putin, a love story. I'll read you the description. The not-so-secret admiration for Vladimir Putin plays out in a teenager's bedroom where the fantasies of this forbidden romance come to life. Watch this.
Do you have a relationship with Vladimir Putin?
I do have a relationship with him. A lot of people would say he's put himself at the forefront of the world as a leader. Russia is like, I mean, they're really hot stuff.
Oh my God,
this is so filthy. We can't show you much more of it. But
oh my God,
the point is this,
stupid.
Laura. This is the narrative they're trying to portray, and they're getting a lot of pushback today. I've been flipping through the New York Times opinion pages. On July 7th, or 6th rather, they posted a story, why Scarlett Johansson should not play a trans man. She was about to play a transgendered man in a movie. Now, their argument was, you can't have someone who is not transgender playing a transgender character. So why is it okay to have two straight men in what is essentially a gay romantic comedy? A lot of people are pushing back, including LGBT activists. And I think you have a tweet there from a rather prominent writer.
Yeah. Well, we have a tweet by. This is funny. We have I have to put this together. We have a tweet by Arnold. No, we have a soundbite by Arnold Schwarzenegger. Should we play that now? Or no, we'll put.
No.
Yeah.
Go to Mike Drucker. It's Mike Drucker's tweet.
Oh, okay.
And I don't have it in front of me, but
yeah, here it is.
You
Sorry.
should have it there.
It says here it is. Congrats to everyone doing gay jokes about Trump and Putin, throwing your own beliefs under the bus for a political cartoon they'll never see. I see what you're saying. Oh yeah, they get caught in their own petard here.
Well, and look. People are very upset about this in the gay community, and rightfully so. They're making light of their lifestyle. And in addition to this, if you're the president and you know this narrative is out there and it's in the pop culture and it's in movies, I'm going to show you another clip in a moment of a show called Our Cartoon President, Stephen Colbert Show on Showtime. They, too, make the same argument. So why fall into the trap and give them real ammo when your substance tells a very different story? Watch this. This is from Our Cartoon President.
Yeah, we don't.
I guess they don't.
I don't think. Yeah, we don't have that actually.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't have that.
We don't have it.
But the point's well taken. The point's hold on. The point's well taken. The New York Times is declining in readership, declining in influence, and even if this was a Twitter deal they did with a stupid, idiotic cartoon video, it's moronic. It's offensive, of course it is, but it's moronic. This is where journalism has gone. It's all one big Saturday Night Live, spoof video. It's embarrassing. It really is. And
my problem is, I think people want an escape. They don't want to see this stuff. And if you look at the top-rated movies of the weekend, Laura, it was Hotel Transylvania and Ant-Man, because we've got a lot of monsters running around, and heroes are smaller than ever.
Yeah, exactly. And ahead, thank you, Raymond, a big-time protest in Chicago over a police shooting. But you won't believe what the police body cam footage actually shows. We'll have the full story next. Both sides. It's an ongoing American tragedy, yet you don't see many protests demanding change. Unless, of course, a police officer is involved. And on Saturday, officers shot and killed 37-year-old Harith Augustus following a confrontation. A violent protest quickly broke out, and Chicago police say 4 officers were injured from the demonstrators throwing rocks and bottles, some of which were filled with urine. Police swiftly released body cam video of the encounter, which appears to show Mr. Augustus with a holstered gun around his waist. Protests continued tonight, however. Joining me now for reaction is former LAPD detective Mark Furman. So, Mark, based on what you've seen in this body cam video, I've had a chance to watch it a couple of times. Do you think these protesters tonight had a legitimate beef?
Well, Laura, once again, we have a false narrative. And just like in the Michael Brown shooting, you have a false narrative about his hands were up, he was running away, not running towards the officer, but there was no body camera. Now, Superintendent Johnson in Chicago immediately released something that's really out of protocol and really actually harms an investigation, but he did it to try to save exactly what's happening. And this body cam is the view of an officer in a tactical situation that is crystal clear, something that you will rarely ever see again, crystal clear, and everything there is the evidence that points to a justified police shooting. I am in shock that the public in Chicago is up in arms about this man acting as he did, armed with 4 officers.
Well, isn't it the case, Mark, that there's such a level of distrust that is fomented by, by some actions on the part of the police, but also mostly by these Black Lives Matter protests and organizers who come in and immediately start to stoke public outrage about these incidents. They call for the mayor's resignation. I'm no fan of Rahm Emanuel, but they're calling for his resignation tonight. The resignation of other top city officials, saying they're violating the ongoing, consent decree with the government. There's real damage done again, and everyone seems to be afraid to call this what it is. It's crime in reaction to an unfortunate, awful situation. But a lot of the protests turned into criminal activity over the weekend.
Absolutely, but let's not forget the suspect precipitated his own death. He had many opportunities where he didn't have to die, and he chose to do what he did, and he did die. But when you look at this narrative of Black Lives Matter, it's the boy who cried wolf, and pretty soon nobody's going to listen when there is really an incident where they actually should take up protests and actually demonstrate their power to actually get justice. This is not the case.
And they're comparing this, Mark, to Laquan McDonald, that case, of course, saying this is another police cover-up. They don't even believe the video that's released. They don't believe that. They think, you see stuff online that's all fake. It's a fake video. It's made by the police. It's not really what happened. It's another Laquan McDonald situation.
Well, then the police and the city government in Chicago should just ignore them then. If they're not going to be reasonable and look at body cam footage, you can't do anything more with police officers than put a camera on their chest and have you view what the officer views and actually see the action the officer takes against the suspect and the reaction of the suspect. You can't do anything more. If they're not satisfied with that, then just stop placating their demands.
Yeah.
Stop listening.
And remember, hands up, don't shoot. Even when that was proven to be a complete malarkey, they still have that in protest signs. Hands up, don't shoot from the Michael Brown case. Mark Furman, thank you so much. Always great to have you on. And Lisa Page meeting with members of Congress for a second day of private testimony. So did her lover Peter Strzok fail to tell the truth during his testimony last week? Judge Jeanine Pirro joins us next to analyze.
Why would you go out of your way